First of all, I'd like to say welcome everybody to our first research seminar for 2022. So happy New Year. But of course, this is an ongoing series from the beginning of October of our History and Archaeology Research Seminar series for 2021 to 22. And this is an extra special last minute drop in celebrity special space for Dr. John Naylor, who agreed very short notice to give this talk. And I'm really pleased because it fits in, not only because it's nice to see John, but also because it's nice, so it fits in very well with this week's tomorrow's lectures for my third years on Vikings in England and Francia and stuff. So this kind of somehow might just, almost like it by design, work for them, whether they actually are rocked up here or they're going to be again watching this later. This should gel nicely with the stuff I've been less precisely discussing, and we'll have a real expert to talk about Viking-Age England. But without much further ado, I just want to say, obviously, John is an eminent scholar and well-known researcher on all things early medieval, although he was just convincing me a minute ago he's also now an Iron Age and Roman specialist in all things to do with archaeology and coinage. But I know John for over many years for his work on not only Anglo-Saxon coins, but also the broader North Sea world. And he agreed to speak to us today about a very special long-running project he's been working on the Viking Age world of the Watlington Hoard. So I shall waffle on no more and hand over and welcome John to give his talk. Thank you, John.
Great. Thanks very much, Howard. I shall share my screen, which we have tried, so hopefully this should work okay. There you go. Can you see that okay?
That's fine. Yes, thank you.
Brilliant. Lovely. Well, thank you ever so much, Howard, and thank you for having me, everybody. I must confess, I kind of invited myself, to be honest. I was emailing with Howard, and I said, "Why don't I give a talk?" So here I am on the. I'm not sure if a sort of extra specialist is necessarily right, but very, very happy to be talking to you about a very long-running project of mine, started in 2015. But before I start, I should actually say that this is not really, in a sense, a solo effort, even though it's got my name at the top. It comes out of broader research that's been done with colleagues, really sort of based on a book of the Watlington Hoard, which we're hopefully publishing early this year through Archaeology Press. I'm waiting for the proofs to come, so it should be very, very soon. And that book has been co-authored with an Ashmolean colleague of mine, Eleanor Standley, who is the curator for medieval antiquities in the Antiquities Department. And so she has had a lot of input in the writing and editing of what we've done. The objects that are discussed in the Hoard were written up by Jane Kershaw, also at Oxford, and some of the other work was done by Eleanor, and also based on Barry Yeager at the British Museum, his treasure report that went in. My focus was the Anglo-Saxon coinage, and some foreign coins, which I'll talk about, were looked at by Simon Copeland, who is sort of the doyen of Frankish numismatics, and also some work by Julian Baker, my colleague in the Ashmolean, who's the medieval coin curator. And lastly, there is also Ryan Lavelle, who wrote a nice piece for the book on sort of the historical background to 9th century Oxfordshire. So I wanted to make sure that they were all cited, because their work has definitely informed what I'll say today and my own interpretations of what was going on. Is it going to go forwards? I'm having a little bit of trouble getting it to go to the next slide. There we go. So, background to the Watlington Hoard is that it was discovered in October 2015 by a metal detectorist, a guy called James Mather. He was detecting on land near Watlington. Unfortunately, we can't give the actual exact details of where the site is. The landowner is very worried about sort of illegal detecting on his land, and there is a real problem. So at the moment, we can only say that it was found near Watlington. But up to a point, with what I'm going to say today, that's not too bad. It gives a broad landscape. You have the Icknield Way coming down sort of past Watlington, and so if it was found in that area, it's all within this kind of zone of communication thick-nailed way, which then passes over the River Thames and sort of becomes sort of what we think of really as the bridgeway going up sort of south of Wantage and down into Wessex. Now James found the hoard, and thankfully he stopped digging and called his local finds liaison officer, David Williams, sadly no longer with us, who went out a few days later and excavated the hoard and found that it was in a package really about 30 centimetres long by about 15 centimetres wide, so quite small, quite compact. It had probably been in some kind of wrapped in cloth or leather or something like that, which no longer survived. But it was all very tightly compacted. It had been hit by the plough. There was a few bits and bobs which were elsewhere. A couple of ingots were found a few meters away, and a couple of coins as well. So if it had been left in there very much longer, another couple of years, and it would have probably been quite badly damaged. So in a sense, it was lucky that James came along and found it when he did. The find then, obviously, because it's a hoard and precious metal, it went through under the Treasure Act 1996 and was declared as treasure, which meant that a museum could purchase it. And that was the Ashmolean. We acquired it in early 2017 at a eye-watering cost of £1.35 million, which we are very thankful to the Art Fund and the Heritage Lottery Fund for their help with that. But that also funded a project, both public engagement and the academic work on the hoard. So it's been an exciting and very busy and quite daunting few years in its own way. But what about the hoard itself? So the hoard contains both coins and objects. This picture here has obviously got a selection of the coins. So there's just over 200 silver coins, 201 are Anglo-Saxon pennies, and 2 are Carolingian deniers, so the equivalent of the penny. Then there are 15 silver ingots. You can see those here at the top of the image. Arm rings and some hack silver, and these are arm rings and neck rings. I'll go into more detail on all of this in a minute. A tiny piece of gold, probably from a neck ring or an arm ring, and then one small silver object, which is a hooked tag fragment. So I'll have a look at those in a minute. Looking at the coinage first, this is quite an important collection. I mean, numismatically, it's very important. These are all very, very rare coins. 2 main types. One is the 2 emperors type, and the other is called the cross and lozenge, just sort of named from the design on the back. And they have radically improved what we know about the coinage. But I'm not going to talk in too much detail about it today. Just give you a very brief overview. The 2 emperors is the one that kind of the media always like. It's got the sort of very attractive design on the back, and they were sort of they were issued by both Alfred the Great and Ceolwulf II of Mercia around sort of 875 to 877. And the design on the back with these 2 emperors, even though it's based on a Roman coin, really sort of brings to mind ideas of alliances and perhaps even some sort of propaganda. And very importantly, because they're issued by more than one king, is actually question the historical documents which suggest that Ceolwulf was a puppet king installed by the Vikings. And we really have sort of changed the views on that over the years. Sort of not my work. This is Mark Blackburn and Simon Keynes from the 1990s produced an original corpus of these early Alfred the Great and Ceolwulf coins, where they sort of there was a lot of work done which showed that sort of Ceolwulf was seen by the Mercians as a real king, and it was perhaps only later that the relationship with Alfred fell apart, which was then within the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was certainly made the most of the propaganda there to call him a foolish king's thane. So there are 13 coins of the 2 emperors type, very rare. When I first saw the hoard, first half of it came in to the Ashmolean before the excavations. We had about 80 coins, and there were 6 of these 2 emperors types. Previously, I'd only ever seen 2 published, so that was quite a stunning moment, and certainly handling them and knowing what they were worth was was quite daunting too. And the other coin type is another one, struck in the name of Alfred the Great and Ceolwulf II of Mercia. There's also a couple of coins of Archbishop Ethelred of Canterbury. So again, these coins represent some kind of alliance between Mercia and Wessex. The thing is, this isn't actually something that should be seen as unique. They'd issued joint coinages since the 860s, Burgred of Mercia with Ethelred of Wessex and with the early coins of Alfred. So there was a precedent for this that continued. But these are a good quality silver coinage, so they're a real thing. They were a real coin reform, so aimed at real sort of monetary reform. And they are quite a large coinage. They are classified in various ways, using the moneyer's name in part and what we know of where the moneyers were working. And so there are different styles of coin which have been attributed to mints in London, Canterbury and Winchester, and other places too where we're not sure where they were. The work that I've done on Watlington suggests that there could have been mints in southern Mercia, probably at Oxford, possibly Gloucester. It's uncertain, but just looking at the styles of the coins compared with some other later coins that we know. So there may have been sort of 4 or 5 mint places. There's also one coin of Alfred the Great in the type that follows on from the cross and lozenge. So somewhere around 879 to 80, it's possibly slightly earlier, but the evidence is very difficult to read on these early coins of the 2-line type. There's just not enough hoard evidence or research done on them. But this one, the weight standard is quite low, so it's about the same, 1.3 grams, about the same as the cross and lozenge. So it's early in the sequence. They get heavier very quickly, to about 1.6 grams. The money here is dealing, so this is a London coin. And it is the latest coin in the Hoard, so it is the coin that gives us a rough date for deposition sometime around 879 to 880. It probably wouldn't be much later, because if it was, we would expect to see far more of these 2-line coins and fewer of the other coins. And alongside that, there are 2 Carolingian deniers. This is work that Simon Coupland did for us, identifying and discussing these. One of Louis II, which dates 855 to 875, and then importantly one of Charles the Bald, which is 875 to 877. So very near to the date when the hoard was likely deposited. Both were minted in the north of Italy, probably in Pavia, which is very rare. We don't find many of those at all. And I'll discuss how they may have actually ended up here later on. And this graph here, as Howard would know, I'd have to put a graph in somewhere. This just shows how the cross and lozenge is by far the most dominant part. Most of the coins are of Alfred, outnumbering Ceolwulf pretty much 3 to 1 really. And the others are actually quite a minor part of the hoard. Even the 2 emperors is quite a minor part, probably because these are slightly earlier and they were less long-lived. So this was the bulk. This was the main coinage, and this is the most important one. Now, most of the coins in the Watlington Hoard are in what we call the London style, so they probably came up minted in London, followed by Canterbury. There was relatively few coins from Winchester, but in reality, we have so few finds overall that it's hard to know if that actually represents what you would expect, or whether it is actually less than it should be. So in a sense, we can say it's a southeastern bias, but the important mints were in the southeast. So we're still awaiting more finds before we can really understand exactly what's going on and where it may have been put together. But I will give some ideas later on. One important aspect of the coinage is that these weren't all just random single coins. There are quite a few kind of groups of coins that are what we call die-linked. So they were all struck using the same sets of dies. You can see sort of Chilwolf the second. There's this group here of 6 coins as an example, all struck from certainly the same obverse dies and mostly the same reverse dies as well. And then there's this group here of 8 coins of Alfred, again die-linked via the obverse, and quite a few of the reverses. I think all the reverses on this are also die-linked, and another group here of another 8 coins. So what this suggests is that when the coins left the mint, they weren't circulating freely. It wasn't like a cash economy where people were just buying and selling using single pennies. These left the mint as a group, and they stayed in packages and were used in that way. It may be that they were just used as wealth storage, and so they never went into sort of, in a sense, sort of circulation as such. They circulated just in these groups, and it could be that they didn't really go very far at all. You can see that they're all very clear, very fresh. A few of them have got post-deposition or damage, and they're actually all quite fragile. But they're all in good condition regarding their striking and very little wear, so suggesting that they weren't moving between hands particularly quickly or very much at all. And that's important because it does show that sort of certainly at least elements of the hoard were not just drawn out of sort of an easy moving circulation. They were actually going to be transferred as a package. That was a whistle-stop tour of the coins. And then there are the silver and the gold objects in the hoard. So a lot of this is based on the work that Jane Kershaw has written up for the book. Virtually all of the objects are what we could consider Viking, except for one, which is this little fragment of an Anglo-Saxon hooked tag. It's silver. It's got a cross design and a sort of quite a crude Trewiddle style decoration to it. When it first came up, it was so encrusted we thought it was possibly a halfpenny, because there's a cross design on some of the contemporary coins, which we thought it may be. But as soon as it was cleaned up, it was obvious that it was something else. And so you have this little hook tag with a sort of a ladder-like cross in the middle. And that's quite interesting in that this kind of design, you can see one here, another one from Oxfordshire, is kind of regionally constrained to the sort of Thames Valley, Wiltshire, and then out towards the east. So it seems as though it was probably picked up quite locally to where the hoard was finally deposited. And it is the only non-Viking object that's in the hoard. So it's actually quite an important one in its own right, that it was obviously added at some point to the other objects. The other ones are all sort of typically Viking in a sense. There are the 15 ingots, these little sort of cigar-shaped pieces of silver, just crudely cast in a mould. Some of them, like this one, you might be able to see these little nick marks, have been tested for their silver. Quite a few of them have got testing on them. And they are not random weights. They seem to cluster around the sort of the aura weight standard of around about 25 grams. So you've got sort of a cluster sort of just between sort of 20 and 25, around 50 or so, and then up there's the one up nearer 100 grams. So they do seem to adhere to the sort of the typical Viking weight standard. Typologically, you can't date them very closely, so they could be anywhere. If they were single finds, they'd be anywhere 9th to 11th century. But because of the coin dating, we know that they're quite early ones coming in the late 9th. There are then neck rings and arm rings. This one up in the top left, 1.16. This little lozenge section penannular arm ring. It looks quite a lot like the sort of ring money that you see in the north of Britain and the Isle of Man in the 10th century, but it isn't. This is, in fact, probably it's of a type found often sort of in sort of Sweden, Gotland, and probably coming into the Baltic via Russia. So it's really an Eastern Baltic type, which dates to the 9th century. So the find of this in the Watlington Hoard is actually quite important. It may be the earliest one that we have in the country, but I'm not sure. I'd have to go back to Jane's text to be sure of that. So this is an important find, and this has also got a little nick mark. You might just be able to see it just in here. So this has been tested as well. There's a broadband armouring fragment here, 1.17, with these little dagger-shaped stamps on it. This is very typical of late 9th century objects found, or coin-dated objects found in Denmark and sort of South Scandinavia. And it would have been sort of this. It didn't taper. It was this width all the way around. So just a small fragment of that. It's only a couple of centimeters long. And then there are two complete armorings with these sort of wound terminals. Both of them have these wound terminals. One is plain with a circular section. The other is a lozenge shape, and you can see it's got this nice stamped decoration on it. Paralleled by objects in the Querdale Hoard, and also in hoards and stray finds from sort of the western sort of Baltic, so sort of southern Scandinavia, finds from Denmark and sort of southern Sweden and southern Norway. So it is these are two quite typical finds from the period. The neck rings we have over here are just hack silver fragments. We have these sort of nice wound neck rings with a plain terminal. This one's been broken. The other one has a complete terminal on it. I'm just checking my notes here. The Watlington examples are actually very early in this type. Most of the ones we have, even from Scandinavia, are coin dated to the 10th century. So having securely dated 9th century examples, especially in Britain, is a very early and quite an important find. So these, and the fact that these are also hack silver suggests that they have been used and have been around for a little while at this point. So these are interesting finds. And then there's the little tiny piece of gold. So literally it's about a centimetre long. This is just a piece of twisted rod, probably from an arm ring or a neck ring. There's not enough left to be sure, but they are very, very rare in 9th century hoards. So to have a piece of gold in the hoard is quite remarkable, and is an important tiny find. So just to sort of summarise sort of geographically where the hoard comes from, we've got this map. You can see the bulk of the objects are coming from the Western Baltic. There's the one arm ring from the east. The coinage and the hook tags all come from like the southeast and central southern Midlands, really. So this circle's a bit big. You could really be saying sort of Kent, London, and then over into the Thames Valley and looping down again. So something quite constrained. The star is obviously Watlington. And then there are the two Carolingian deniers from Pavia. Now I've got an arrow here going up to the Netherlands. And the reason for this is that the likelihood is that these coins came into Britain via a Dutch route. They're not found in hoards very often, but they are found in Dutch hoards. So it could be, so they were obviously moving up, probably you assume up the Rhine and along the coast. So there are two hoards that are interesting up here, several hoards which have got these Italian coins in. One which seems to be of a similar date to Watlington, around about 880, which has got coin of Charles the Bold of exactly the same type in it. There's one hoard from eastern France with one of these Italian coins, but none from further west. So the likelihood is it came up via this route onto the North Sea. So that's actually sort of quite important for how it may have all been put together. So how was it put together? You've got this English component and you've got the continental component. And in a sense, the Netherlands here is very, very important. From the 850s to around about 880, the north, what we think of now as the North Netherlands, sort of Friesland, was settled by Vikings. There was certainly Scandinavian settlement there. We know archaeologically that there was. There's quite a few strafe finds. There's quite a few hoards, and there are two from what is the island of Vesterkleef. So Vesterkleef 1 and 2, which are actually really sort of useful. Vesterkleef 1 is a mixed hoard of coins, Islamic dirhams, Carolingian deniers, and objects dating to some were in the 850s. The objects in that hoard are all complete, or mostly complete, suggesting that objects were coming in and being sort of used, and at that point they weren't being broken up into hack silver so much. The second hoard, which is the one that's got the Charles the Bald denier in it, dating to around 880, is also a mixed hoard of coins, Carolingian, Islamic, and also hack silver, lots of fragmented pieces, so ingots, especially, or chopped, also pieces of jewelry and neck ring. So it seems entirely likely, given the evidence and the evidence from stray finds of lots of hack silver in this area, it would seem likely that the whole objects at least came directly from Scandinavia. They weren't hanging around very long on the continent. So they were brought together probably in southern Scandinavia and came down. It's likely that the coinage came from this area. And it could be that some of the hack silver was picked up here too. We can't be sure, of course. But it seems as though that is most likely. And given the date of the coins, it would seem that given the date of the coins, it would seem that this was quite late. So somewhere around at least 877, but possibly even 878, which is quite late, given that Watlington was probably buried within 2 years. And at this point, you have the Great Viking Army, which I'll talk about in a minute, were active in Wessex. And so it's entirely likely that this was a group who were coming down into Britain, joining up with the army. Viking armies were tended to be sort of amalgams and alliances of lots of different groups, sort of working together, splitting off, going elsewhere. And so this group probably came in quite late to join with the army, no doubt when they were in sort of probably in sort of what we now think of as Wiltshire, and which is obviously not far from where Watlington was buried. So that seems likely how it came together and when. So how does Watlington actually relate to the Great Viking Army? Because that is something that is very important. Given that sort of Viking activity in the West Country was very much contemporary with the burial of Watlington. I should have pointed earlier that Watlington is the only sizable Viking hoard in the Upper Thames Valley. There's nothing else nearby. So it is sort of on its own in a sense, until you look at some of the other finds. So looking at the movements of the army, this is sort of a very typical map. They're often in sort of Viking textbooks. So this is similar. So obviously in the north, Torksey and Repton in sort of 872, 874. And 874 and 875, they move south and they head into Wessex. They raid Wareham in 875, where they stay. Then move to Exeter, where they stay again over the winter. Move up to Gloucester, down to Chippenham, where they attacked Alfred's and his entourage. Alfred escapes to Athelney, where he hides in the marshes and burns some cakes. And then they meet at Eddington, probably, which is in Wiltshire, in 878, where Alfred defeats the great Viking army under Guthrum, and they come to an agreement, and they move off to Cirencester, where they overwinter before heading off to East Anglia, where they settle, Guthrum becoming known as Ethelstan, his baptismal name. The most likely route that you would take from Cirencester to East Anglia would be you'd head down to Swindon or on the Roman road, and then there is the Overland Ridgeway route down to the Thames, across the river, and up the Icknield Way, which goes obviously right past Watlington. And so that seems to be the most likely route they take, and the most likely reason why we have a burial of the Hoard at Watlington. And why Watlington? Well, it's right next door to the major royal estate at Benson, and Benson had control of quite a wide area, so really sort of a whole area, sort of parts of the Tame Valley and the Chilterns. Quite a big site. It was the richest royal estate in the area, and it would seem entirely reasonable that this army in a truce may have stayed on the estate to obviously they needed supplies, they needed subsistence after a long, no doubt crossing the river is not an easy task with a large group, and so they probably stayed there before moving on. And it may well be that the Hoard itself could be related to perhaps an advance party who would have gone on to secure what was needed regarding supplies. There's a similar argument for a Hoard in Croydon from the early 870s, that it was a group who were securing supplies for the army, although under different circumstances. So that's that's why Watlington seems like an ideal place that this ends up being buried. But what other evidence is there actually for the Viking Great Army in southern Britain in the 870s? Many of you may know of the research that's been done in the North Midlands, sort of Torksey and Repton, at the Viking camps there. Dawn Hadley and Julian Richards did some fantastic work, especially at Torksey, where they identified, I think it's a 50-hectare site, many hundreds of objects of precious metal and copper alloy, a lot of hack silver, a lot of chopped up objects, weights with inlaid sort of decoration and coins, Northumbrian coinage. It seems as though it was almost like an enormous processing site for sites being stripped all around. And so you get this sort of signature of object types, ingots, deniers, dirhams, sort of belt, sort of decorative objects of copper alloy and of precious metal, all of which were being used, melted down, and the like. And what we have left is substantial, but no doubt nowhere near what was actually going through it. And we don't have, although we know they overwintered, we don't have as much evidence from the south, and that would seem entirely reasonable, given that in this area they've defeated Northumbria. There's a sort of a power vacuum in this area, you could imagine, which you don't have in the southwest. You've still got a functioning state. They're still issuing coins. They're still issuing all sorts. You've still got a functioning royal house. So you perhaps wouldn't expect to have quite the same evidence, but there is material down there. Not very much, and on its own, it perhaps doesn't mean an enormous amount. But when you put it together, in this map over here, it does make more sense. So here's Watlington up here. So the Viking army has come down. In the Watlington area, there are some ingots. There's also 4 or 5 Northumbrian stikers, little copper alloy coins, which are very rare outside Northumbria, and they seem to be related to the Viking Great Army. There's lots of Torksey. There's also a couple of dirhams. There's a gold, one of these, a gold solidus, which are imitations of Carolingian coins, which we now think were actually struck in the northern Netherlands by Scandinavians. So they are a signature of Viking activity. And there are also Carolingian deniers around there. So there's activity up around sort of Watlington and Oxford, also Cirencester, where we know they overwintered. Around Wareham, where again they attacked and overwintered, there are quite a few objects like this inlaid weight, Here, these are all PAS finds, by the way. This inlaid lead weight, sort of a nice bit of, you might be able to see, you'll see a decorative bird, no doubt in a vine. So you've got that there. There's quite a few of those. There's a gold ingot, there's some silver ingots, and then they moved along the coast, and you can see there's more finds over to Exeter. There's a handful of finds around Exeter, couple of arm rings. Exeter itself, there is another one of these gold coins. Just down the coast at Teignmouth is a chopped up ingot. And there's a small spread of finds elsewhere, not a lot around sort of the Gloucestershire and Somerset coast, but you can see that there is a general spread which together is indicative that there is certainly Viking activity. One of the problems is, of course, that a lot of this you could quite easily date to the early 10th century as well. But in a sort of illustrative sense, it does suggest that you can see their signature, albeit sort of quite light. You can see there's a group down here of Carolingian coins. These are probably not Viking related ones. They all come from the Mint of Mel in sort of near Brittany. And so they probably came up via Atlantic trade, and they're found in Viking hoards up in the north as well. So that was quite an interesting little aside. But you can see there is evidence for the Viking Great Army, sort of where they are known to have been, sort of from documentary evidence. The last thing I really want to look at is sort of how Watlington fits into other hoarding in the mid to late 9th century. Now, there's a few hoards I want to look at here, which are of use. There's Croydon, which was deposited in the early 870s. A couple of hundred coins, 250 coins, some hack silver and some ingots. Unfortunately, this was dispersed in the 19th century. The Ashmoleans got a couple of pieces. They got the ingots and a bit of hack silver. The coins are all over the place, but it was all pieced together by diligent work many years ago now, which suggests that sort of it was deposited somewhere around 871 to 872. There's also the sad story of the Herefordshire or near Lempster hoard, which you may have heard of in the news. About 300 coins and objects we think were found. They weren't reported as treasure. Only 30 have been recovered, and 4 other objects, including a silver ingot. Very similar to Watlington. Includes the two emperors and cross and lozenge types of Alfred and Ceolwulf II. There's an Islamic dirham. There's another Carolingian denier, although a different type to the ones that we've got in Watlington. And it's tantalizing. So hopefully things will come to light as time goes on. But there was a court case in 2019 when the finders and an antiques dealer were jailed. So not reporting your treasure does have consequences, but it's a real shame that this is such an important hoard and contemporary with Watlington. There's also a tiny one just further up the Icknield Way in Buckinghamshire at Pittston, where there are 5 cross and lodgings coins, including a halfpenny. 3 came up together, and then there are 2 other finds which we think are associated from the same parish. So it's likely that these 3 hoards were all deposited around about the same time, within the same year. The other hoards that I haven't mentioned here there's Leon C, where there's several hundred coins probably in a burial. There's the Dorking hoard, which was another few hundred coins. The Trewiddle hoard, which may be related to sort of church activity. It may be Viking. It's Anglo-Saxon coins and Anglo-Saxon objects, so we can't be sure. The same as one at Beeston Tor and another in Norfolk. But what's interesting is that Watlington and its like are often thought of as being kind of small or middling in size, just sort of a couple hundred coins and a handful of objects. But that's thinking about these hoards in relation to the big hoards from the north in the 10th century. So sort of something like Querdale or the Vale of York hoard, where there are hundreds, if not thousands, of objects and coins, really big. But those relate to periods of sort of settlement and also periods of reconquest, sort of by the house, or conquest by the House of Wessex, as they were extending their power across the whole of England. Whereas in the 9th century, certainly sort of the 860s and 870s, you've actually got a wholly different situation where you've got a groups moving around the country, raiding, moving on, and so the likelihood is your wealth is going to be carrying relatively small packages. So in reality, you can see Watlington's a couple of hundred coins, as is Croydon. Leominster is somewhere around about 300. There was 500 in Leigh-on-Sea. So Watlington is actually of a good size for its period, and that's actually an important thing to recognise. And the only other place I wanted to highlight was on Anglesey, the site of Llanbedrogol, where there is activity and a Viking-Age settlement from about 850, including ingots, hack silver. There's a small hoard of Carolingian and other coins, and it just shows that there's this Irish sea focus. There are stray finds around the coast as well, and it may be that Leominster is related to activity. It could be a group moving and for whatever reason they buried and didn't get any further, but moving towards the Irish Sea. But are these three hoards, Leominster, Pittston and Watlington, are they related in any way? Could we see them as being something of a sort of adding up to something bigger? Well, there's two things in that sense. One is in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which for 878, it describes the Battle at Edington, obviously from the position of Alfred as victor, where the Viking army described as being under Guthrum, were beaten by Alfred, and Alfred laid siege to them. The Vikings surrendered, gave hostages, and promised that they would leave the kingdom and be baptized. And on staying with the king, with Alfred, he, as it says, my italics, greatly honoured him and his companions with riches. So it seems entirely likely that there was some kind of tribute paid alongside. And we think that the Croydon Hoard was probably a tribute as well. And there are other instances where tribute was paid, both in Britain and on the continent, sometimes very large sums. So it seems entirely likely that the riches paid were some kind of tribute paid to the Viking army. And it seems entirely likely too that the best way to pay them would have been in coin. And there are some links between Watlington and these two other hoards. It's quite conjectural in a way, because you do get die links between different places all through the early medieval period. But there aren't that many die links within the overall corpus between sort of Watlington and all the other finds that have been made. But there is a link between 3 coins and one of the coins in the Pittston Hoard. So this one here, coin 49 in Watlington. The obverse and the reverse were also found in a coin in Pittston. And even though there's very little published material relating to the Leominster Hoard, just all I've had is what was in the media. But even so, there is a die link between a Watlington penny and a Leominster penny. So there's obviously links between them. So it's not out of the question that actually these may be related to each other. It could be that there was a great number of riches given by Alfred to the Great Viking Army. It was then divided up between different groups. And what we see in these 3 hoards is perhaps part of that. I mean, it's something that we can never know. But given the dating and the history behind it, it seems entirely plausible that may well be the case. So just to sum up, this has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour through both sort of the Watlington Hoard and other contemporary finds, both sort of in this country and elsewhere, and how it may have all come together and what it may have meant. I mean, Watlington is remarkable. It's been a real pleasure and a privilege to be able to work on it for about 5 years. And hopefully the book, as I said, will be out sort of within the next few months, once we've got the proofs through. Its contents span Europe from sort of the Baltic down to the Mediterranean, into the North Sea, as well as this whole group of Anglo-Saxon material. It should be recognised as a large Viking hoard from the late 9th century, one of very few from southern Britain and the only one in the Upper Thames Valley. The location of its burial can be directly linked to the movements of the Viking Great Army in the late 870s, and there is this tantalising prospect that it may be related to a tribute or a gift paid by Alfred the Great after the Battle of Edington. So I shall leave it there. Thank you ever so much for listening.